Hey all, this is a follow-up to my video, How the Kazon Could Have Been Great, which was talking about, the Kazon from the first two seasons of Star Trek Voyager, where they're the primary antagonist, and they're not very popular and not very well received. And I think that's a shame because in that video I kind of talk about the potential if they had actually made them a true analog to gang culture as opposed to making them a series of racist stereotypes about gang culture, which are two very different things. In that video, I kind of talk about the idea that if the Kazon truly operate like gangs, the different Kazon sects, then they would have different relationships with the other races in the Delta Quadrant. They would have different alliances, and they would operate kind of a protection racket, where the different systems in their territory would either be extorted into providing them with goods and services, or the Kazon would actually serve as protection, protecting them from other sects, protecting them from raiders, helping them fight their enemies, connecting to different client states, and collecting a percentage. The more money you make, the more you prosper, the more they prosper. And so, and how the Machas would compete in different ways and have different spheres of influence. You might have one sect might be arms runners, one sect might run the Delta Quadrant equivalent of Las Vegas, a moon with all sorts of illegal dealings. Uh, but what I want to talk about is their opposite number, so to speak, and the oppressor culture that dominated them beforehand, the TRABE. Now, we don't really know that much about the TRABE because they only appear once in the very controversial, in my opinion, episode of Alliances, which makes Janeway appear to be a racist. The TRABE are alluded to in the episode Initiations by Carr, and the story is that the TRABE either evolved on the same planet as the Kazon or took it over and oppressed the Kazon, forced them, exploited their labor, dominated them, kept them living in poverty and ghettos or reservation type imagery, and the Kazon eventually and the Kazon existed in either various sects that either the Kazons had and the TRABE capitalized on it by pitting the sects against each other, or the TRABE may have created the sects themselves as a means of keeping them apart. And where this really ties in well with the gang analog is it mirrors a lot of the work that happened in the 60s by the FBI COINTELPRO program, which actively infiltrated and provided disinformation to civil rights and black power groups like the US organization and the Black Panthers in California and the Bay Area, and eventually pitted these two groups against each other. And the descendants of those groups, or rather, some would argue, individuals trying to capitalize off of that legacy, formed the Crips, and later, as a reaction to the growing power of the Crips, other local gangs banded together for self-protection and became the Bloods. That's an oversimplified version of the history, but I think it kind of connects to the spirit of what they were trying to get into with the relationship with the Kazon and the TRABE. Now, if you wanted to really expand the TRABE and make this concept work, uh, you would follow up on what I said about the Kazon. The TRABE occupied a very large empire, maybe comparable to the Federation or the size of the Klingon or Romulan Empire. And now that empire is now cut up into a series of pockets dominated by the sects. But you wouldn't just have the TRABE as an entire species in mass like Battlestar Galactica wandering around the Delta Quadrant. They could have long since left the Delta Quadrant. Uh, but as Mavis, the leader of the TRABE that you meet, is shown to be a liar, it's probable that it's a lie too. While it's likely that the Kazon would be harassing the TRABE and trying to keep them from settle, it's unlikely that the Kazon were able to 100% uh, take away all of the TRABE's territory and holdings. So what you'd really have is an area that was once the size of a federation, now divided into pockets that are controlled by the TRABE and pockets that are controlled by the various sects of the Kazon. And those areas that are controlled by the Cabe would be incredibly oppressive to any remaining Kazon who live there. In fact, there may very well still be a great number of Kazon who still live under brutal subjugation by the TRABE. And I think that's something they could play up as well, and let the people of Voyager see what the living conditions like are of the Kazon on these TRABE enclaves. And I think that would give another dimension to the conflict. I think it's also one thing that the episode Alliances, which again is very controversial because you leave that episode not understanding what they're even trying to say, and I is that the the TRABE have gotten by this long by pitting the sex against each other. But it also points to Neelix's statement that, oh, the Kazon stole everything they have from the TRABE. But if you look in the history of where one group here in our history oppresses another, the first thing they do is rewrite the history so that they did everything and that the people they oppressed had nothing and were living in squalor and in huts. And didn't have great cities. And you see that with presentations of African Americans, of Native Americans, of cultures all over the world, that these people had nothing going on until they were enslaved. And it also mirrors Cardassian Bajor, where the Cardassians' portrayal of Bajor as being a century behind them is very different than what you hear about the actual things in the show about the ancient Bajorans. So that's one. It may be very well that the TRABE and the Kazon had technological parity and or near technological parity, and when the TRABE dominated the Kazon, they took that all for themselves. It's also most likely that if the TRABE were this big a starfaring culture and they were utilizing and exploiting the Kazon's labor to support that, then Kazon would have very technical jobs in the infrastructure. It's quite possible on TRABE vessels the Kazon occupied a lot of the technical um, and NCO rank positions, while the TRABE overseers acted as the officers. Or the same thing in a company where a CEO might not know as much about the day to day as the CEO's personal assistants, who might know everything that's going on, or the people in the mail room who know everything that's going on. This would make it more logical for how the Kazon overthrew them. So the key is about the TRABE is if their primary tactic was keeping the sex against each other, what makes us think that that stopped? Perhaps Voyager could discover that the TRABE are still engaged in that kind of activity, and Alliances shows that. I think also more needs to be made up of how much the TRABE superficially appeared like the Federation appears, and that the root of the Kazon's mistrust of Janeway and the Voyager crew is that they look and act very much like the people who oppressed them before. It also stands to reason that the TRABE would still have allies out there, people who they traded and did business with, who looked the other way who are aware of their oppression of the Kazon, but look the other way. And further still, with this blood feud between two races, there's another race that could easily sit back and profit from funding and in turn engaging and manipulating conflict of both sides. And that comes into my next video coming up, the Great Vidian Conspiracy. Uh, but the TRABE, I think, only being shown once, um, didn't do accomplish its goal. I think it partially made the Kazon's position a bit more sympathetic, but I don't think they went all the way. And I think Janeway's incredibly sanctimonious speech at the end of Alliances shows that she nor the writers really understood what was going on in the episode they were making. If you look at the episode of Alliances, the Kazon actually went into these negotiations without pulling any funny business. Yeah, they didn't trust anybody. They weren't ready to form a Delta Federation, but they were actually at the table sincerely. They were listening. It was Mavis's betrayal, a la at The Godfather, that made things go to hell. And where Janeway really needs to be called for task for this is one, she kind of poo-poos the whole idea of any kind of diplomatic solution with the Kazon anyway. Um, she then forces Chakotay and the crew to engage with the Nistrum, which is the least logical a group of Kazon to speak to at all, it'd be much more logical to talk to the ones that you haven't encountered yet, um, or even maybe Car's sect with the Ogla, since you already have some sort of relationship. Um, but no, instead they get involved with the Nistrum. She creates a poison pill, which in turn forces Cullen to create a poison pill, and it just bogs down into ridiculousness. All of a sudden, Mavis, who comes up, the first white guy she meets, with a very dubious history that he doesn't even deny, and she's already ready to form an alliance with them, blinded by her dislike of Cullen and his pronounced sexism. Now, that makes sense. I mean, Cullen's a very unlikable character, and he is constantly pronouncedly sexist. Uh, but I think it made Janeway seem inexperienced and immature as a diplomat and as an explorer and someone who's trained in first contact situations and in diplomatic situations. Um, Further, I think that they're not called into task for seeing that superficially they and the TRABE uh, may seem similar to the Kazon. But that's what I would like to have seen explored more. While you have all these different dynamics between Kazon sects, you see that behind it, they're up against a real enemy. And just because they're free doesn't mean the TRABE aren't still out there marshaling their forces and in many cases trying to engineer Voyager into doing their work for them. So I thought you had a great opportunity with these two races to kind of play between them, and you could have them have an impact on an episode without even having them be prominently in it, uh, by ramifications of their events across the quadrant. But we're going to get to why everyone's fighting so much in the Delta Quadrant and why so many people seem to have just had lost a war or had their government collapse or their government instantly becomes fascistic. It's all about the Vidians.